Okay, so welcome everyone to Breaking Open, Loving Your Life as It Is and As It Can Be. We have two very, very special participants and speakers today, and I'm going to introduce each of them. Um, Before they talk about their own works, after I introduce them, we're going to have a question that everybody can sort of think over while they discuss their works and what this topic means. So without further ado, we will start off with Dawna Markova. Dawna followed her precious grandmother's footsteps to become a midwife, but rather than babies, she helps birth possibilities within and between people. She has lived many incarnations in the past 7 decades as an author, teacher, psychotherapist, researcher, executive advisor, and organizational fairy godmother. One of the creators of the best-selling Random Acts of Kindness series, Dawna is the author of many inspirational books, including I Will Not Die, An Unlived Life, Reclaiming Purpose and Passion, Reconcilable Differences, Connecting in a Disconnected World, Collaborative Intelligence, Thinking with People Who Think Differently, and A Spot of Grace, remarkable stories of how you do make a difference. This conversation that we're going to be having today draws on her latest book, Living a Loved Life, Awakening Wisdom Through Stories of Inspiration, Challenge, and Possibility. Dawna, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and oh, yep, Fiol.
Oh, you want me to talk now?
Oh no, I'm gonna introduce Marlena, and then we will turn it back over to you.
I will not talk now.
Yes.
I just saw faces of people I loved and I was moved,
Yes.
but I will now sit back and be quiet.
No worries, no worries.
Not in
And our other guest is Marlena Fiol, PhD. She grew up on a leprosy station that her strict Mennonite father founded and ran in Paraguay, South America. Her new book, Nothing Bad Between Us, A Mennonite Missionary's Daughter Finds Healing in Her Brokenness, from Mango Publishing, is a heartwarming and often shocking tale of a religious father and his sinful daughter as they gradually move towards forgiveness and healing. In her career as a consultant and professor of strategic management, Marlena guided her students and clients to, in coming to know both their current and possible selves. Over half of her 85 published articles and books relate to identity and identity change. Today, she combines her professional expertise in identity with her poignant personal experiences to speak with compassion and authority on complicated relationships and the healing power of forgiveness. Marlena, welcome.
Thank you, James.
And before we ask each of these lovely women to discuss their works, I know Dawna has a very specific question that she would like everybody to keep in mind as we move into the conversation. So Dawna, I'll let you pose that question. And then after that, if you want to tell us about your book, you can have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. It's delicious to look and see this little strip of faces on the right side of my screen, and warm tears come because I see faces of people I love and adore deeply. The question I would like to ask us to hold together and ask you in particular to reflect on for a minute or two before you reflect on us is, what would it feel like if your life broke open? And I offer that question in a bow of respect to Amanda Gordon, who last Tuesday, a week ago, Tuesday, 10 days ago, said, "We are not broken. We are just unfinished."
And I know we're going to ask everyone to take that that question and internalize it. And if you have responses, please post them in the chat as we talk. Yes, thank you, Dawna, so much for posing that question. And Dawna, if you could tell us about your most recent book and what it means to you and what it means to our conversation today, that would be absolutely lovely.
Well, my most recent book, which I'm supposed to hold up, I'm supposed to have posters and everything of it. I'm not good at this part of writing books. It was, I think, my 18th book. I wrote it because I'm 78 years old, and there are stories, my mind thinks in stories, and there are stories that I wanted to leave as a legacy for my son. I'm not leaving my son a lot of money. I'm not, most of the things one thinks as an inheritance or a legacy, I'm not leaving. But there are these stories that he's heard me tell, some of them 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that were passed on to me either from my grandmother, or they were passed on through me from people that I worked with. And they're medicine stories. And it seemed to me that that would be the best legacy that I could leave to him. And so I compiled them all. And the book is called, I wrote a poem that I'm not thinking in straight lines. You're gonna have to follow me, which is okay. You can kind of drift off as you wish. So I wrote a poem called I Will Not Die, An Unlived Life. And the poem's been read by, I don't know, millions, literally, of people. A day does not come by when somebody mentions the poem or writes me or Instagrams me or whatever they do. And I wrote the poem the day my father died. And that was a day when my life broke open. But it seemed to me at that particular time that my life broke because my father was very dominating. Well, that's the polite way of saying it. And my relationship with him was very stormy and very significant. And so like the rivers that freeze in Vermont, the night that he died, my life was like, there's a time about a little later in the year than this, where the rivers is a loud crack. And literally the rivers that have been frozen for the whole winter break. And the river begins to flow. And that night that I wrote that poem to him, he died of Alzheimer's. That night was like the rivers breaking. And so that poem gave birth, and those stories that I wanted to record gave birth to this book. I midwifed this book called Living a Loved Life. So that's how this book came to be.
Awesome. That's thank you so much for the insight, and thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure that you have a lot more that we will jump into, and we have a lot to discuss. So I will ask Marlena, if you could tell us about Nothing Bad Between Us, and how you came to us today for this conversation.
Absolutely. So at one level, Nothing Bad Between Us, a Mennonite missionary's daughter finds healing in her brokenness, is a book about a very rebellious missionary kid. I struggled between two contradictory forces. On the one hand, I wanted to be accepted by my hero doctor father, who founded a leprosy hospital the year I was born in a Mennonite community in Paraguay. I wanted to be part of his Mennonite clan. And at the same time, I rebelled terribly against the abusive controls that were put on me. And this all came to a head when I was a teenager, and I was brought before my Mennonite congregation. I was humiliated and rejected because of sexual misconduct that I had to stand in front of the church and talk about. And my father rejected me and threw me out of his life. I escaped at that point to the US, but as all of you know, when we escape with our shame, there's really no escape. We're still locked in the shame and the anger. And so at one point I hit rock bottom. And at that place, at rock bottom, is when I broke open. And that was really the beginning of my healing path. I was flawed. My father was flawed. My Mennonite church was flawed. But my book is not a railing against them or even against my own failures. It's also not an easy recipe, 1, 2, 3 steps to healing. It is a story about very imperfect people moving along a very bumpy road toward eventual reconciliation and healing. And the premise of the book really does relate to the brokenness theme of tonight. And that is that it's not despite my brokenness that my healing began. It is exactly because of it, and I am so sure of that, that my healing process began. And it's a never-ending process. It's a lifelong process, but that was the beginning. And we can talk more about what brokenness means to me in our book, but I will leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much for sharing. And Dawna, again, thank you for sharing. And thank you for posing the question, what does it mean to break open? What does that mean? And how does that relate to each of us and the struggles that we face? And you and Marlena have come from 2 completely different backgrounds, but you still understand the meaning of breaking open. And so I thought, Dawna, I'd give you the opportunity to sort of come back to that question now that people have had a chance to think about it, and explain, we now know what the metaphorical significance of it is in terms of the river cracking open, but perhaps you can start to dive in and what that means and how deep that goes.
Well, I'm going to leave Vermont. I'm looking at my hands right now, and my hands are doing this. And the metaphor for me that has been most potent in my life has been a seed in a shell. And when I used to teach kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, we would, like probably most of you have done, take lima beans and put them on paper towels and watch as the seed, which had been so nice and snuggy and warm in its shell, started pushing. And you could see this little teeny nubbin come out, and then it came out a little more, and then a little more, and then a little more, and then a little more. And then there was the struggle. And the struggle was between the shell, which had kept that seed so safe inside and so protected, and the force of growth. Safety, growth, safety, growth, safety, growth. And that has been a theme my entire life. When a baby is born, it's the same thing, safety, growth. So I believe we're at a time like that right now. And the forces within us which want to reach are pushing against the forces that want to keep us safe. When I was, where am I going to go? Where's my mind going to go? Okay, when I was 29, she says and surprises herself, maybe 28. My son, David, was 4 years old. I had been in an incredibly abusive relationship that was normal. I lived with, I married the prince. He looked like a prince. It turned out that the prince had a few issues, as we would say now. And he almost killed me and almost killed my son. We'll make that short. But I was a princess, and I always did what I always had done. And nobody in my family had ever gotten a divorce. So leaving him seemed not to be an option. And it seemed to be the only option, both at that time. And I had, when the shell broke, I had $200 to my name. I went into a magazine that had just started in Fort Lauderdale called New Woman Magazine. I had no idea why I was doing this, how I was doing this. I was in a total state of la-la mind, otherwise known as symptom trance. But I talked my way into talking to the editor, Margaret Harold, and I said, I want to write a story for your magazine, a column. I'm going to write a column for your magazine. And she said, what's it about? And I said, it's called Alternate Lifestyle for a Frustrated Housewife. And it's going to be about myself and my son, who's 4 years old. And we're going to drive around the world. And that was the beginning of a 2-year journey that I have not written about yet. Maybe I will, maybe I won't, where we drove 50,000 miles around the world. And we went to Africa, we went to China, we went pretty much every place, not every place, but it seemed to me pretty much every place. And I was terrified for probably the first 25,000 miles. But I had to know who I was when I was not in that nice, snug princess shell. So that's the first time that comes to me, which is a surprise to me, but it's the first time that comes to me when you ask me that question in this moment. That's when I broke open.
That's lovely. And Marlena, I guess we will continue there with the same thing for you. What is
Yeah,
that?
I never knew the snug princess shell. But at the same time, it took me a long while before I broke open. Yes, my father beat me when I was a very young child, and my church humiliated and rejected me, and my father threw me out of his life. Those were certainly attempts to break me. But my response at the time was just stick my chin up and, you know, put that armor around me and put up the defenses and show the world that I didn't care. I could be strong. And it was really the first moment of that I recall of being broken was not until well into my 30s. I mean, for those of you who are familiar with the Enneagram, I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. And what 8s, especially when we're unhealthy 8s, what we fear more than anything else is to be violated and to have our strength taken away from us. And so being vulnerable is the worst possible thing you can ask an 8 to do. And I had lots of 8 armor around me. At one point, I ended up on the floor, desperate, broken. All of my anger had even died. It was simply a desperate place on the floor, and my ego was there on the floor with me. And it was really then that I began to understand, and this was a long journey of understanding, but that was the beginning when I understood that what I had done was lock up inside of me, inside of that armor, so much fear, so much shame, so much anger. I didn't want the world to see it, but what was happening is that it was doing its secret dirty work inside of me. That took a while to recognize. That didn't happen on the floor, but being on the floor, being broken open was the beginning of that journey. The forwardist for my book, Phil Kuzno, talks about soul rust. And that's what it is. My armors, that's what it produced, is soul rust that corroded me from the inside out. And gradually, and it was gradually and over a lot of time, I began to open up the space for more vulnerability. And that's been one of the main parts of my spiritual path, is to learn to be open and vulnerable in the face of my failings and others' failings. And I'll talk later about how terrifying it was to show those first cracks in the armor. But I'll leave it at this and let Dawna continue.
I'm metabolizing your story. I'm taking it in. Yeah. I listen to you, and what comes to me, I'm aware of your jaw, and you talked about the Enneagram and that 8, and I don't know the Enneagram very well, but all I wanted to do when you were talking was put my hands on your jaw. You have such a beautiful jaw, and your jaw is so strong, you know. And that makes me think of,
In the air.
pardon?
Especially when it's stuck up in the air with lots of armor.
No, I didn't see it that way. I just wanted to reach out and put my hands on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawna.
It made me think of this this woman I used to work with, who's a dear friend of mine, whose picture is on my desk, and her name was Paris. And when I first met Paris, she didn't have a lower jaw, and she could speak 5 languages. She was a remarkable being. She is in my life. And then I thought about this line, which I wrote a long time ago, which is unlearning to not speak. And in the 5 years of driving around the world, I spoke to a 4-year-old for the first year anyway. So that phrase is so important to me because my mother, I wondered as I was driving, where was my mother when my father used to beat me with a belt, with the metal buckle end of a belt. And I know he loved me, and I knew then he loved me for my own good. Where was my mother? Where was my mother? Why didn't she say anything? And at the end of her life, long after my father had died, I took care of her for the last 2 weeks of her life. And I washed her. She lived in an apartment by herself in Colorado. And I washed her. I washed her breasts that used to nourish me. It was a gorgeous experience and a heart-wrenching experience. And my mother would be very modest, of course, being who she was and where she was and the time she was in. So she always had to put on her nightgown by herself. And she always put on a nightgown that was a shmata. Shmata in Yiddish means rag. And that surprised me because my sister and I bought her these beautiful Bonwit Teller silk nightgowns. No. I later found out what happened to them, and I'll tell you at the end of the story, if the story ever ends. Anyway, so she was in bed, and this was the last night of her life, but I didn't know that. And I tucked her in, and I always tucked her in, and I kissed her on her forehead, and I put my hands on her jaw, which is what made me think of you, Marlena. And then I pulled the covers up over her. And as I'm pulling the covers up, I notice that she's wearing something under her shmata nightgown. I said, Ma, what is that? What are you wearing under your nightgown? And it was rubber. And it was called a Playtex living girdle. Now, James, you don't know what a Playtex living girdle is. I will tell you that women used to, thank God, I hope they're no longer in existence. They're just a sheet of rubber, about 1/8 of an inch thick. And women would wear them day, most women not at night, but day, so that they didn't wiggle or move. And I always thought it was kind of like to keep them in like a sausage or something, because they were really thick. And I said, Ma, why are you wearing a girdle to sleep? And she said, I always have. I said, you always have? And then for a minute I thought about, well, you know, how'd you and Dad, but the girdle was just a sheet of rubber. There were no legs. So evidently, anyway, you don't want those details. So I said, but Ma, Dad's dead. He's been dead for years. Why are you still wearing one? And she looked up at me with these huge brown eyes and she said, because it wouldn't feel like me without it. She died that night. The next morning I came in and I found her, and weeks later I went through her apartment and she knew it would be me that went through it. And there in her dresser was one of those tall dressers. They called them a high boy, not a high girl, a high boy. And there were many drawers. And in the drawers, I found the nightgowns we bought her, wrapped so carefully in tissue paper, in the original tissue paper. She knew I would find them. And she wanted me to find them and my sister to find them. They were too good for her. And in the same way as when my father died, the rivers broke open in me. When my mother died in that way, it became the beginning of my, what I call unlearning to not speak. My mother never said no unless you asked her if she wanted chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream. No, I'd make you too fat. But there were so many things I wanted to hear from her, so many things questions I asked her that she never answered. How'd you put up with daddy? Why did you let him beat me? All those questions, she didn't speak. But the last word she said to me, and she looked right up at me with those kind of Coca-Cola brown eyes, was, I'm sorry. Those are the last words. She never told me sorry about what, which was the gift, more than the nightgowns from Bonwit Teller, more than anything she had ever given me, because it gave me permission to wonder, what was she sorry for? Well, she could have been sorry for this. It must have meant that. She could have been sorry because she let daddy hit me. So she gave me carte blanche to be who I am, to say what I need to say, to be free as the shell let go. That was her letting go with those two words. I'm sorry.
That's beautiful. And for me, one of the most poignant things that you said, and I think so true of a lot of us, not just your mother, is without whatever the armor is that we're covered with, I wouldn't know who I am. I wouldn't know who I am without that protective covering, right? I mean, it was very, very scary to allow cracks into that armor. And I can just quickly describe a scene in the book. It was my parents' 45th wedding anniversary. And my father and I had come a long way toward showing up for each other and beginning to see the common humanity. I won't say we were fully reconciled, but we'd moved a long way in that direction. So he calls me and he says, Marlena, we're having a big gathering for our 45th wedding anniversary, and there will be hundreds of our Mennonites there. It'll be the entire congregation, and we would like you to be the MC for this event. And I was terrified. I mean, here I am, this is 20 years later, 20 years after standing in front of the Mennonite church that threw me out. And I still was in fear and shock and terror about the idea of standing in front of those Mennonites. But I did it. And it was my first glimpse into the power that can be without the girdle. The power that we have, the strength that we can have vulnerably standing in front of those people, some of whom had been there 20 years earlier and had thrown me out, and understand I just glimpses of it. It was just the beginning, but I began to understand that I could be without the girdle, without that protective covering that was keeping me from being vulnerable and real. Yeah.
When I first met you, which was on a phone, something or other like this, I don't know what it was.
I interviewed you for my podcast.
Okay, there you go. And but it feels like you and I have known each other for so long, and somehow we got in this question that was in my mind. There were two questions. And even now, as you speak and you talk about these Mennonite men, one of the things that we discovered we both have in common was we were talking about the patriarchy and what a role it played for each of us, for the breaking of each of us and the breaking open of each of us. And I told you then that I didn't I didn't like the term patriarchy, but that it was changed for me by a woman who wrote a book whose name was Riani Eisler. I think she's still alive, please. But anyway, she wrote a book called The Chalice and the Blade. And I read the book, I'm trying to think how many years ago, a very, very long time ago, I'll say that much. And it was part of my unlearning to not speak, because she talked about two forces that I've come to think of as two deep, basic thinking strategies. One was domination, which is part of the theme that you and I, that force, that way of thinking that bonded us, you and I. And the other side, and that's the blade, and the other side of the blade was the chalice as a symbol. And I just made one today on the pottery wheel. The chalice is empty, but it is the symbol of partnership, because the chalice must be filled continually and emptied and filled and emptied and filled and emptied. And the resonance between you and I that I remember in that conversation was that I think, I feel, I imagine that we are living in a time right now where the thinking strategies that have dominated us for so long, particularly for the last 5 years, if not longer, and of course longer, but are shifting, major tectonic shifting into thinking in partnership, which is why I wrote Collaborative Intelligence and why I wrote Reconcilable Differences. And we don't know how to do that. I just got an email from a woman who read a mailing I sent out, who I helped her. She was in the Mormon church, and her father sexually abused her, and he also was the head of for years, dragged her around the house by her hair, and he was the head of their synod or whatever they call it. Everybody in the community would applaud him. And I did some work with her, which was amazingly liberating for her. We were very close when I lived in Utah. I haven't heard from her in 15 years. She wrote me a letter, and she had gotten my mailing, where I shared the poem Breaking Open. And she said, all it was like Fox News. All it was a defense of the domination that we've come to know, particularly in the last 4 years. And I was stunned. And I kept thinking of Riani Eisler and the chalice and the chalice and the chalice. So I said, it must have taken you a lot of courage to reach out to me. Please continue to do so. That's what I wrote back to her. And I don't know what else to write. I don't know what else to write now, at this moment. So this theme of domination and partnership takes me to a question to you, Marlena, about what is that transformation like for you, and what has it been like for you, and how in the world did you forgive your father?
Yeah, people, particularly people who've read the book, have asked me, how can this be a book about forgiveness and reconciliation? Because your father and you never said, I'm sorry. And it's true, it's not in the book. And it's true that in life, that didn't happen. It is a book about forgiveness, and is a book about reconciliation. And I think, in my experience, the I'm sorry, sometimes there's nothing wrong with saying I'm sorry, but sometimes it trivializes the journey of forgiveness, the journey of self-exploration that is required to really forgive and to reconcile with someone. What happened is that we showed up. We showed up again and again and again. At first it was really uncomfortable, but we kept showing up. And eventually, people also ask me, who was the broker of the peace between you? You know, who stepped in first? And I think often we play this power game of who says I'm sorry first, or who has more to say I'm sorry for, and it becomes this transactional thing. My response to who was the broker of our peace was, it was not I, and it was not my father. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I think it is something close to grace that was the broker of our peace. Now, we needed to step in to the space where grace could do its work, absolutely. But it was us showing up vulnerably and seeing each other's failings and each other's vulnerability. Last night, I had this amazing conversation with someone named Tom DeWolf, who's been working on racial injustice and bringing people to the table around questions about racial injustice. And I love one of the lines in his book, which I kept talking about last night, which is, we need to learn to cry together. And in some ways, that's what my father and I learned to do. We learned to cry together. When, just to finish off the story about the 45th wedding anniversary, when I finished doing it and there was this glimpse of this new possibility that I had experienced, we went to their house and we're sitting on this old squeaky pink sofa together. And there's a lot of commotion. I have 7 brothers and sisters and they all have big families. It's what Mennonites do. So there's a lot of commotion going on around us. My father and I are sitting next to each other on this sofa. And I grabbed his hand and I said in our late native Low German, "Du hast nicht verstanden." And what that means, you probably can understand this in the Yiddish, because Low German and Yiddish have a lot of similarity. It means there's nothing bad between us, which is where the title of the book came from. And that was what my father and I said to each other for the last 20 years of his life, every time we said goodbye. And one more thing, and I'll stop on that, but I love what my memoirist said about that line. Phil Kuzno said, saying there's nothing bad between us in that kind of way, in that refrain, is to constantly acknowledge over and over again, there was something bad between us. We didn't say, I'm sorry, but that phrase, which I never thought about until Phil Kuzno raised that, but yes, it is an implicit acknowledgement of, yes, there was a lot bad between us, but no more, not in this amazing grace-filled moment. Yeah.
Absolutely beautiful. And I know Marlena and I talk about that moment quite a bit. And I was wondering, I was hoping that you and Dawna could talk about we've kind of hinted at it, but what a gift wounds can be, in terms of, we often think of wounds as something that needs to be as healed as quickly as possible because it's doing damage to us. And we don't see it. And kind of the theme of this evening is, how do we love life right now, even if we are inflicted with wounds that threaten to overcome us every day? And you are both shining examples of how that can be done and how you can love your life through that. But I just thought we'd address that and sort of dive into that idea that living with wounds can be still a loved life.
Well, I've had a lot of practice with this question. I've lived inside of it through 6 times of cancer. I've lived inside of it through a lot. And I think it's because of, Marlena, what you were just talking about, that the story that comes in my mind is one I've told many times, but I hope when I tell it, it will break my mind open in light of what you were talking about with your father. I don't think I ever said, I forgive you. And the wounds that I carry or carried from my father, at the end of his life, my mother was still alive. They lived in an apartment in Hollywood, Florida. And I was told about 3 years before that he had Alzheimer's, or 2 years, more or less. And I went to see him to say goodbye. And he and my mother lived in this little apartment, and my father hadn't spoken to anyone. And what I say about when I first saw him is it looked like he was locked behind these invisible walls. And he had flaming blue eyes, just brilliant blue eyes. But now they were, and he was a lion, he was a Leo, he was, you know, could speak to 5,000 people, and he's very fiery. And, but now he sat all shrunken in this rocking chair that I have in my other room. And the rocking chair didn't rock, but it moved when he breathed. And he was looking someplace that I couldn't see. And I knew I couldn't climb the walls. They were palpable walls, but I couldn't see them. And he was locked behind them. And I wanted to say to him something. I wanted a connection like you had, Marlena. And I said, Daddy, I love you. I love you. Nothing. And I just sat there, and tears rolled down my face, and my whole history with him unfolded, all the wounds, all the oozing, all the in front of my face. And I couldn't figure out what to say. So I put my purse, we used to call them purses, on my shoulder, had a shoulder strap, leather, brown leather. And I stood up getting ready to leave. And one of the things that my father would do after he beat me with the belt, because I had done all these terrible things like teased my sister, things like that, is he would always say, here's a nickel. Now don't tell your mother. As I grew older, the things that I did grew in badness, according to him. And he would beat me and then say, here's a quarter. Don't tell your mother. They still have quarters, right? Yes. Okay. Then I went away to college. And I, more than anything, until I went away to college, I wanted him to say, I love you too, sweetheart. He never said it. So I went away to college, and I pounded on pillows because I was learning psychotherapy, and that's what we did with bataka bats. And I screamed and I yelled, I hate you, Daddy. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. But this day in Florida, when I knew I would never see him again, I was standing with my purse on my shoulder. I took his little hand, I took something out of my wallet, and I took his little wrinkled, the way old people's hands like mine get, and I put it like this in front of me, and I put a $5 bill in it. And I closed the hand over the $5 bill, his hand. And I said, here's $5, don't tell Daddy, don't tell Mommy. Here's $5, don't tell Mommy, Daddy. Here's $5. And I stood up, and he blinked, and he looked up at me, and he said, I love you too, sweetheart. And that was the last thing he ever said to me. And I suppose that was a state of great, I don't know what that was, but the great, great, great lesson that it taught me was the importance of entering another person's model of the world. And I know I'm going to somehow, I don't know how, I haven't learned it yet, enter Elaine's model of the world. I know there are people that I have not spoken to whose model of the world I will have to enter somehow, some way to reconcile.
Yeah.
And it won't be by discussing politics, but it will be by making that connection.
I think that's a huge challenge for all of us right now in this season, is to figure out how to approach people within their model. It's huge. But let me just say a few words in response to James's question about the gift of our wounds. We all hate the dark times. Absolutely hate I don't know of anybody who doesn't. In German, the word gift means poison. And I think that's how many of us treat the dark times, as poison we want to get through and get done with.
Wait, the word gift means poison?
In German. Yeah, I know, isn't it great? So that's high German, not low German.
Oh.
During this COVID season, how many times have you heard people say, this too shall pass, or we can hang on until it's normal again, or it's always, and I find myself doing it also. I mean, we all do it. And yet, what if we could take the gift of this dark, for many of us, very dark moment and say, what is there for me to learn right here, right now? Because the truth is, and I don't think this is just me, I imagine many of you, and I hope we can get to questions and comments from you all very soon, because I'd like to hear from you. But in retrospect, the dark times have taught me so much, but it's often been in retrospect. And the real challenge for me is they've taught me compassion, they've taught me resilience, they've taught me to do things I wouldn't have even imagined that I could do. But in the midst of it, it too often feels like gift, like poison. And so the challenge for me is to stand in the dark space, in the wound, and say, what am I here to learn? What is this trying to teach me? And so that's a huge challenge, ongoing challenge for me. I'm too busy wanting to get out of the wound and get out and quit hurting.
I think, I listen to you and I think, I feel, what if we could swim in it? When Andy and I moved here and they had all these, when they riot in Hawaii, it's a really funny thing. When they have demonstrations, it's a very funny thing. It's like palm trees demonstrate. And so Andy and I have been to a lot of demonstrations in Hawaii. And I have this sign that says, be strong like water. Be strong like water. And so I wonder how we can now be strong like water. I wonder, I can't think of dark. I can think of dark as a gift. I don't know how to think about dark as a poison though. It's so much the other side of everything to me that I don't know how to think about it as a poison. I love dark. I know how to think of it as a gift. I can stop, 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 and I can wonder. And so to me, wonder is an art form. It's an evocative art form that's born out of questions, which is why questions have been the threads between you and I for all the long time we've known each other. But there are questions that you can ask, and it's how you ask yourself the question. So what is this time trying to teach? So what is this time trying to teach me? So what is it I'm supposed to be learning now? That's one way.
Or you could say, what is it? I'm open to it. What is it?
Right.
It's almost the awe and the wonder of it, even though it hurts like hell. Yeah.
So I think that the wonder is for me, and the thread between you and I don't know how you smell. I don't know how you feel if I were to hug you, but I think wonder is an art form that we have that connects us.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, truly wondering, what all those little faces in all the squares, what are the questions you're all sitting with? What are you wondering about? Am I allowed to just do that and ask that, or?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And while we wait for people to send in some questions, and what that means to them as well. And Marlena knows this about me, and Dawna, I don't think you do. My father abandoned our family when I was 15 years old, and I became the head of the household, and basically gave up everything to work every day, and then go to college on the weekends so I could get extracurriculars and not have to do as much college later on. And I delayed that sense of wonder of what I could be. And it was delayed for almost a decade until I finally broke, until I broke open and lost control. And one of the things for me and mine was that I was afraid of who I was going to be. I was afraid that I was going to carry on either what my parents did, or carry on with my self-destructive patterns, which were pretending I didn't have any self-destructive patterns, pretending I was totally fine. And so as we wait for everybody to chime in, I just wanted to say that's something where it is, the fear of it keeps you from
It froze.
eating that wonder.
Has everybody frozen?
Oh.
So, no, I don't think so. So James, you froze for a moment, but I just want to say, I would just like to say thank you so much for interjecting that. And the piece I picked up, and that was so important to what you said, is when I lost control. That control piece is so destructive for us when we want to enter into the place of awe and wonder. It isn't a place of control, and it isn't a place of domination. It isn't a place of armors or girdles. It is a place of openness. And so I loved the way you put that. And thanks for sharing that, James.
Absolutely. And I'd welcome everybody to, if you have even comments, oh, am I cutting out again?
No, you're good.
You're there.
Yeah, we're having, it's a big storm up here in Northern California, so we're cutting in and out. But yeah, comments, and please share them. I know we're coming to the end of our discussion, and we love to hear what everybody has to say. And there's nothing, even a random comment, there's nothing that you could throw out there that we will scoff at. So please join in.
Wait.
You go.
Your story really touched me.
Thank you.
And if my grandmother were with 15, if my grandmother were with me, she would ask me to ask you, so I'm channeling her now. Finally, I get to channel an entity. Would you look at your fingerprints at the end of your fingers right now, just in this moment? Okay, and there are marks there. Every one, all 10 are different one from the other. But never before in all the history of humankind has there been another with marks like that. Never. And never again will there be a human being with marks like that. Never. You are one of a kind. And the moment you were born, life made a promise to the world. This one. So I just want you to remember that from my grandmother and through me.
That's, I'll never forget. And Marlena's smiling because I lost my grandmother just about a year ago. And so this is, it means a lot to me. And I appreciate that, Dawna, really, truly.
Good.
I know people have stories. I know people have questions. Don't be shy. And while we wait, Dawna, I know you had a poem that you wanted to read, and perhaps while we wait for some additional comments, you would be willing to read that for us?
Okay, I just want to put little kiss faces on all the people that I see there. There's Ellen and Lynn. Okay, here we go. This came after the inauguration, and after Amanda, I heard Amanda Gordon's poem, and it's amusing. And Andy and I put these out once a month. So I write a poem, and he listens and feels it, and he composer's music to go behind it. And one of us takes a photograph of this gorgeous place we live, and we send it out to about 1,000 people that we love dearly. It's called Broken Open. Where are you when you're not thinking? Where are you when you awaken from the drum roll of thoughts, the grasping, grabbing, marching down the endless list of what you should do, down the highway that divides who is right from who is wrong? Where are you when wonder carries you on a current of your heart as if you were floating on endless possibilities? As if the shell that has protected your tenderness softens and splits open? Where are you when you remember the green shoots of who you really are, reaching, always reaching toward what can be possible, toward what can blossom between us, toward what it is that only you can bring?
Thank you so much, Dawna. Thank you. And so we've got a couple more minutes. And so I did end up getting one email that I checked right before that had a question. And it was, I'm going to paraphrase it as best I can, just because I know we're short on time, but it was when we are, basically the question was, there was almost a guilt or shame about loving your life in a moment of either crisis or in a moment of trauma, of feeling that was something to be ashamed of, in terms of finding joy in those moments. And I just wanted, I thought we'd wrap it up by, I know you both have very specific, ideas around that. And so I thought it would be a nice way to wrap up is to give your thoughts on that joy that you can find in some of the worst moments of your life.
Marlena.
I think that one of the purposes of our lives is to more fully understand and more fully live from who we truly are. And fear and shame and resentment can never be the basis for who I truly am. And so what I would say in conclusion to this wonderful conversation is that I would wish for all of us that we could open ourselves up to the love and the compassion and the openness to seeing the common humanity of those who didn't vote like we did, or those who don't look like we do, so that our own personal healing can begin to contribute to collective healing, because this world is hungry for collective healing. And I also want to just say in closing, thank you so much, all of you who came. I'm very delighted. It was wonderful, Dawna, as usual, to speak with you and converse with you. And James, thank you. And thanks for your contribution to the conversation.
Thank you, Marlena.
And my request is, I'm not great at this technological stuff, better than I let on, but nonetheless, all these little chats, will I be able to read them when we're all done?
Yes, I have them saved, and they will be going out to you. And for everyone here, we will be following up with those links and a link to the actual conversation again, so that if you missed any part of it, or if you want to share it with your friends or loved ones, you will have that opportunity.
And for those of you that don't know, you can just write to me at Gmail. That's all. Just my name at Gmail. I'm not supposed to give that out. Too bad. I love you. I trust you. I trust myself with you, so that you can find me there. Sometimes people say, how do we find you? That's how you find me. Okay.
The same is true here. It's just marlena.fiol@gmail.com. And my website is marlenafiol.com. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you all so much for being here.
Hawaiian, they say, ahui ho. ahui ho, and ahui ho means until our spirits touch.
Ahui ho.
Wait. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. If you're in Northern California, stay safe.
Be safe, James.
Yes, thank you
Thank you.
guys. Have a
Thank you.
wonderful evening.